Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you aboard the Airport Adventures, Flight 926-2020, from Philly to wherever you want to go. All carry-on items should be now stowed securely on overhead bin or under the seat in front of you. All aisles and exitways should be clear. All electronic devices should be off or on airplane mode. As we leave the gate, please make sure your seatbelt is fastened. To fasten, insert the metal tip into the buckle and adjust the strap so it's low and tight across your lap. To release the belt, lift the top of the buckle. Remain seated with your seatbelt securely fastened anytime the seatbelt sign is on. If the sign is off, we ask that you keep the seatbelts fastened while seated in case we encounter any turbulence. Please take the time to find the closest exit to you. Keep in mind that the exits can be located behind you. Once again, we welcome you aboard the Airport Adventures, Flight 926-2020, to anywhere you want to go. And thank you for flying the Airport Adventures. Please prepare for takeoff. Butterfly in the sky, I can go
All right, thank you for joining us, and you're live on the runway right now. We want to thank everyone for joining us anywhere around the world that you are. Thank you for coming on the runway, the airport adventure. And I just want to say good morning, good afternoon, good night, or good evening, wherever you're tuning in. We're here on the runway, which is a podcast show that's brought to you by the Airport Adventure. My name is Cleus Glory Young, and I'm your host. And today we're going to be continuing to talk about this very interesting topic that we brought to the runway a couple weeks ago. And we're looking at it where we're talking about the concept of bullying. And during the series, we've been highlighting different outcomes of bullying, where we're talking about either the solutions or the problem or the analogy of how we can get it to what we will consider a part of it, where we're saying, let's take this off the runway and bring it to a whole new destination. So hopefully, if you're out there and you're watching this the series, it's something that you can now look at and you said, you know what? Originally, this is what I thought bullying was, but now that I'm seeing the series, I'm now understanding it from a whole different destination. And that is the concept of what we're intending to do with the platform of this type of show. So again, welcome to the runway, the airport adventure, where we're basically assimilating the concept of the airport, where we're saying just as the plane goes on the airport and the airport allows it to take off and go to a whole new destination, that is how we're looking to either bring a guest or a topic on the runway and allow it to go to a whole new destination. So once again, thank you for joining us on such a platform where we don't just want to bring someone on or bring a topic on and then have the regular discussion. We really want to see how could we get to a whole new destination with some of the things that we are aware of. For me, it's like, hey, if we continue to do the same thing over and over again, like we'll never get to a new result. Or for my instance, I would say a new destination. So this is what we've been doing. And as I said, we've been doing a series around this concept of bullying. And we started off where we were talking about even the history of bullying, which most people that are aware of it do not understand the history of it, which we talked about it from the first show that we did back in the 1800s. A bully was the context of a person who is considered a friend or a lover, not in what we're looking at with today's society, where we're saying, hey, today it's someone who is negative, someone who is that quote unquote gangster, or someone who is aggressive. We understand all of that, but what we looked at was from the history of who a bully was. It was a person who was a friend or lover. Somewhere along the line, it changed to this um, what we would call definition that we have today as someone mean, someone negative, someone aggressive, someone who is almost walking around like a gangster trying to intimidate someone else who is called a victim. So when we look at all these things and we said, hey, let's bring it to the platform where we can have a discussion and bring people to a whole new reality or a whole new destination around this topic, hoping that we can get people to understand that this is what we're dealing with and this is how we can address it and bring it to a whole new destination. And just a correlation in the fact that we were looking at it from just the context of bullying, but lately we've been seeing so many similarities that took the same place as far as what was done with the context of bullying. And what I mean by this is that if you look on the history of what is called the swastika sign, um, being famous by Hitler, um, we can actually look at that and saying that it shares the same similarity with the context of bullying, that it went from something positive to now something being considered negative. And something that's interesting as well, we also found out that this word that has been prominent in our life growing up, as we talk about the word sin, one of our shows, we actually discuss it, how this actually came from something positive as well. So even though we're talking about bullying and it's a topic that we're in this platform, there's certain form of a bully, it was done to the same context with the swastika sign. And we also saw it with the word sin. So today, so many people are walking around with the context of saying sin is such and such. Due diligence and see the research of where it came from, then you will understand it came from something positive as well. So this platform, even though we're talking about this topic of bullying, we also show correlation of how things are correlated beyond just the topic that we're talking about. So this way it can really make sense in your life, and it's not just a topic that we're discussing and this has nothing to do with you, which actually brings us right now into a continuation of last week's show when we were talking about the impact of bullying. And I found this interesting, and here's I used didn't see it. So one of the things that was said to us was like, hey, I've never been bullied before. My child isn't experiencing that. So that has nothing to do with me. Or the same context, hey, I've never been homeless before, or I have no concept of what a homeless person will go through because no one in my immediate circle is actually going through that. So when I looked at those concepts, I was saying to myself, even though it's not directly associated with you, indirectly, it could be something that's impacting you. So understanding those things from way back when, I said, you know what, let me talk about it on the show where we're talking about the impact of how bully impacts us from an overall community or overall country our overall society. So last week we were talking about it and just breaking it down from different angles, either directly or indirectly. And I know today we said that we were going to talk about the subliminal effect of bullying. So just to catch up on last week, we were actually talking about how, from a direct standpoint, we may look at it and say, all right, this person is a bully. And how does it impact that person? So we started to talk about how it impacts the person from an emotional standpoint. So if we went back to several of the shows that we did, and one of the series, we were looking at it, how the context of this aggressive behavior, how it is built up. So it moved away from what is called the passive to the assertive to the aggressive. So when we look at it and saying, hey, how does this impact the bully directly? We're looking at it from an emotional standpoint, because you're dealing with someone who has what is considered an aggressive behavior. So an aggressive behavior is some type of emotional impact on the individual. So we looked at it and say, you know what, from a direct standpoint, emotionally, that person is impacted. What happens when you're emotionally impacted, then it actually goes to what you would call the spiritual impact. So now this is actually impacting you from a spiritual standpoint. The impact of where you're looking at it and saying, now from a spiritual standpoint, we're now saying that it's going to be impacting you where the spirit is taking you over. So now what's going to happen with that? Now you're going to go through what is called the physical result. And the physical result is where you're going to go into that contingency now of actually now expressing this aggression out towards a physical aspect. So that's how we looked at how it impacted the bully, where we're saying from an emotional standpoint, we'll start off there because it's an aggressive behavior. And then we move on to what is called the spiritual impact. And once it's spiritually impacting you, then physically, you're going to see how it starts to play out in your reality. So that's how we looked at it from a direct standpoint. Pertaining to the victim, we were saying now, physically, that's how it impacts the person first. And you're looking at it that if a person comes up and starts to bully you, it's some type of physical contact first. From that physical contact, then it goes on to what is called the spiritual contact. And the spiritual contact now is where it's being impacted by the spirit. So now when you look at that, now you're saying from a physical contact of getting bullied, right? It starts to affect the person's spirit. And if it impacts the person's spirit now, then somewhere along the line, this person who is considered a victim may walk away and then later on now begin to think about these things that was done to them. So what happens now, it starts to build up in their emotion. So from a physical standpoint to a spiritual standpoint, and then to the emotional standpoint. And we're going to be showing you later on how this impacts someone from an emotional standpoint when you're talking about the victim and what could happen. So that's how we looked at it. And it's almost like a reverse from the bully. The starting off, the bully develops this emotional imbalance inside of them where they're being impacted emotionally by something that was done to their life. It develops where it's now taking over their spirit. Their spirit now begins to now relay these things outward physically. So physically now it's going out, and then physically now it's being attained by what you would call the victim. And then from a physical standpoint, it starts to now impact the person spiritually. And then if this now becomes something that the person is continuing to think about day by day, then emotionally now it's going to be impacted with that person. So when we looked at that, we were saying these are things that we looked at and saying this is how it impacts someone directly. And then from a bystander standpoint, we were talking about how this could impact someone from a visual standpoint, meaning that you're observing what's going on. And if you observe too much of this context of someone being bullied continually, whether it's that individual or you're taking on a series of where you're constantly seeing someone being bullied, then spiritually it's going to impact you some way, shape, or form. And then later on, just like the victim, there's going to be some type of emotional impact as well. So this is how we looked at it from the context of where it directly impacts what you call the bully, the victim, and the bystander. So now think about it. If you are a person who is a friend, right, to someone who is being bullied, then it's going to directly impact you. If you're a family member, then it's going to directly impact you. And then the other aspect we look at it, if this is someone from your community, then this is someone who is going to be impacted as well. So when you look at that standpoint, now you're saying from a community standpoint, if you have someone in your community and that person is being bullied, right, then it starts to impact the community. So you move from what is called a community, and if we start to see now, how does this start to play out where several people are being bullied in this community, right? Then what happened, and let me break it down for you in one context of what could be also a community. A community could be a school. A community could also be a church. And I know we have our overall community where it's consistent of what is called the church, the school, the library, the daycare, all these different places that will make up a regular community. But you can also find a community in a school. You can also find a community in a church. You can also find a community in a playground. You can also find a community in what we would call a daycare. So when you look at that, those are small communities. And when it starts to impact those communities now, then what happens, it moves on to what is called the city. Somewhere along the line, it starts to impact the city now, and from the city to the state, to the country, to the world. So this is how we look at it from a direct standpoint of saying now, these are the things that will directly impact us. From a standpoint you're talking about, as I said earlier, if you have someone that's a friend and that person is being bullied, then what happens is going to impact you directly, because that's someone you know, and you're going to see how they go through some type of emotional turmoil. So the same thing would happen if that person is your family member. And the same thing if you are living in a community and you constantly seeing someone that's being bullied or different people that's being bullied, then this is what's going to happen, right? And the same thing now from a city standpoint to the state, to the country, to the world. So this is how we looked at how it actually directly impact us. So here's the indirect aspect of what we were looking at as well, as we mentioned last week. So when you look at it now and it's being impacted within the country where it's being brought now, not just to the small community of the school or the church or the library, you're talking about it now being on the contingency of where we're saying this is something that's impacting the country, meaning that there's a lot of statistics that's showing up now that people are being bullied all over the country. So the indirect part of this now, once it's now being impacted within the country, the government really has to look at it. And the typical concept of how the government looks at this now is like, how do we solve this? And we have to look at it from a financial standpoint. So the government typically look at it from a financial standpoint where they're saying, hey, we're going to allocate this type of finances to deal with these social issues across the country. So when we looked at that now, this is an indirect impact of how bullying impacts us. So when you look at it from a government standpoint, we're saying now, listen, from a government standpoint, if this reach all the way across the country and it's something that's being impacted within the country, it's now considered a social issue. The social issue now, you have to provide funding for that social issue to be addressed. So from a financial standpoint, the government may allocate some type of budget that will say, hey, we're going to now create a budget that's going to be addressing this social issue that is plaguing the entire country. Or, and I know one of the aspects that was done here in Philadelphia to help support the school district, they had raised the sugar tax. So this is one of the ways that could be done as well, that if there's a social issues that's actually impacting the country, it also could be indirectly allocated from taxes that are now brought on by the government for the people to actually pay. So even though you're looking at it and you're saying, you know what, bullying doesn't impact me because I have no one in my family or friends, or I've never been bullied, then here is it that we're looking at it from an indirect standpoint, that you may be in a neighborhood or in a country that you're going to be paying taxes, or a part of that financial budget that's now created by the government has to now put in some type of social issue cause to now address this context that's plaguing the entire country. So when you look at it, these are things that I'm explaining to you now in a manner for you to understand. If something doesn't impact you directly, it may impact you indirectly. And this is something that I brought about to my attention when I was back in college. I started to see that different systems that were here in America, and they were the system that were considered the pioneer of America. They were actually coming from somewhere else. So when I looked at that, I was like, wow, you know, this system that was created over this country, right, or this continent was brought over here in America, and it starts to now indirectly impact the people that are here in America without us knowing that it's an indirect impact of something that was created somewhere else. So when I looked at that, I looked at it from the standpoint of saying, you know what, these things that are plaguing us in our communities, sometimes we may look at them and we may say, you know what, that has nothing to do with me. But at the end of the day, everything that happens in life, right, it has something to do with us. It may not impact us directly, but indirectly, it impacts us as well. So when I started to look at that, I'm like, hey, let's talk about this for the context of bullying, because you're looking at it where people may say, hey, this has nothing to do with me. But just as I discussed on one of the episodes where I was saying, all right, this may not have nothing to do with you with the context of bullying, but let's look at it from a word of the word sin. And the word sin, even though this is not bullying, but this was what was done to that same word as well. So now, where did they get this concept from? And I'm not saying it's from the context of bullying, but when you look at it, the same correlation was applied to the word sin as it was with the word bully. And then the same context now, you can look at it and see, oh, this was done with the swastika sign too. So these are things that you look at, and even though indirectly they may look like, oh, they're not having anything to do with each other, it's like, you have to understand the concept. And we have said this so many times, it's called monkey see, monkey do. So typically when someone sees someone do something to something, then they may take it up and then do it to something else. So now we can look at just three contexts: bully, swastika sign, and the word sin. And we can see that all three of them was done with the same context. So when I'm looking at that now, I'm saying either something is going to directly impact you or it's going to impact you indirectly. And then now that brings us to our third aspect. So sometimes things are impacting us in such a way that we don't even know about it, which is called subliminal impact. So this is something that I really want to talk about on this show, because if we understand the context of what really goes on in this world, even to the point where you have what is called subliminal advertisement. And subliminal advertisement is where people could actually advertise things into the public, right? And you will see it and you will never know that this thing has an impact on you. But it's like looking at it where you're saying now, listen, I'm going to go do this or I'm going to do that. And you're not understanding that you're going to do this or you're going to do that because of the subliminal impact of something that's out there that's causing us to do these things. So when I looked at it from the same context, I was like, you know what? They do this with the context of bullying as well. So subliminally, let's look at it. If you experience any type of bullying, not from a standpoint of where it's like a direct, like you were bullied, right? But if you experience it from any type of context, in these contexts I'm going to share with you. If you say, someone said to you, you know what? I'm sharing this story with you about someone who was bullied, all right? Once they begin to share it with you now, you're being impacted subliminal. If you have ever seen a story on the news about bullying, right, you have been impacted subliminally. If you have ever heard any context around the contingency of someone being bullied, you have been impacted subliminally. And this is what I'm saying with this. When you see something, you cannot unsee it. So somewhere along the line, you go through what is called a subliminal impact, right? And a subliminal impact for me is understanding that once you see it, either on the news or you see it in the paper or you see it somewhere, then you start to be impacted by what you're seeing. So let me begin to break this down now from a subliminal standpoint, where from a visual standpoint, once you see something, you have been impacted by that thing. You cannot unsee it. So what happens now, the more you begin to see it and the more you begin to see it day by day, then from a visual standpoint, it's going to be impacting you more and more and more. And you may not understand this, that when you look at something continuously, right, from a visual standpoint, whether you're looking at it from the news, right, or whether you're looking at it from reading a paper or reading a book, when you continue to look at these things continually, then it starts to impact you from a subliminal standpoint. And this is one of the things about, even when we're talking about advertisement, they typically look at it and say, hey, we got to do advertisement in these ways. We want them to see it on the billboard. We want them to see it on the internet. We want them to see it on the TV. We want them to see it in the newspaper. We want them to see it in the magazine. Why? Because they know that the more and more that you're seeing it, it's the more it's going to impact you and influence you to actually go buy what is it that they're advertising. So when you look at it, the same context apply. If you continuously watching news about bullying, or you see someone where you're reading about it in the paper or you're reading about it in a magazine, like visually, it's being impacted in you, where from a subliminal standpoint now, you can actually see that this is now impacting you. And this is how it starts out, similar to how the behavior of the what you would call the bully. You're talking about if you see it one time, two time, that may come from what is called the passive concept. But the more you're seeing it now is the more you're gonna move from the passive to what is called the assertive. And it's only a matter of time before you move from assertive to now going to the aggressive level. And the aggressive level is, this is what I call it, the state of tiredness. So when you see something over and over again, right? It's called now, oh, I'm tired of seeing this. So in that context of where we would normally say just that context, oh, I'm tired of seeing this, it's because you have seen it over and over again now, and it starts to now visually impact you. And from a subliminal standpoint, you may say, hey, I'm tired of seeing this, which is actually going to the context of this, which is what is called desensitize. So when you desensitize someone, it's showing that person this thing over and over again. And now that person, now it has become something that's common to the person. But it's that context of where it's now starting to take a hold of the person from a visual standpoint to the point where now the person is like, you know what? That's normal. That's the way life's supposed to be. And it's normalized now in your life because why? You're tired of seeing it. And it's over and over again that you have seen it. So from a subliminal standpoint, I could actually show you something repeatedly. And then what happens, it starts to impact you to now where you're desensitized to these things. So now you would walk around and you will see it and you'll be like, oh, okay. And you just walk past it like nothing happens. Because at that point, you're desensitized. And it's the same thing now when you're looking at it from an auditory standpoint. If you continue to go around and hear about these things day in, day out, they start to impact you. And it's basically looking at it how, from a subliminal standpoint, this could either impact you either visually or auditory. And these are two, when I tell you, two powerful ways to actually cause someone to be impacted by something. This is what society has done to us. Whenever they want to impact us from a subliminal standpoint, right? They would either put something out there from a visual standpoint or they would put it from an auditory standpoint. And if you don't understand the auditory standpoint, just listen to the music that's being given to us on a day-to-day basis, depending on what culture you're in. And oftentimes now this type of auditory music, right, starts to now impact us. So we take on the concept of where now it's almost like these sound and vibration from an auditory standpoint starts to play out in our life now. And when you look at that, you have to understand this. So sounds that are repeated becomes a reality. Listen carefully. Sounds that are repeated becomes a reality. And look at it. You can be listening to a song on the radio and you hear that song repeatedly, right? And then how does that become a reality? Because at some point now you start to sing the song. So as I just said, repeated sound becomes a reality. And this is from an auditory standpoint. So let's put that into play now from the context of bullying. If you constantly going around and you're hearing around the context of bullying, it's gonna now impact you from an auditory standpoint. And the more you hear it, it's the more now this is gonna be repeated, and the repeated now becomes a reality. So when I looked at that, I was like, wow, this is so interesting because some people, as I said back then, they used to say, you know what, this doesn't impact me. So I'm not partaking in it, or I don't want to have anything to do with it. But in reality, everything that's on this earth impacts us. It's either directly, indirectly, or subliminally, and I could go into other aspects as well, spiritually, psychologically, but I'm just sticking to these three contexts, either the direct, indirect, or subliminal context, where we're saying that when you're looking at the context of bullying, we're not just looking at something that's now being plagued by this context where over here they deal with it because it has nothing to do with me. As I said, if it becomes a social issue where it's something that reach all the way up to the country, then it has to be addressed by the government. And sometimes when you have a social issue and the government allots certain amount of money for that social issue, if that money is not being used up to actually help that social issue, then that money could be allocated to go to another social issue or some of that money. So when you look at it now and you're saying, hey, let's look at something that's plaguing us in the community. So violence. So right now in Philadelphia, there's a high crime rate. So somewhere along the line now, money is being taken from some other social issues to now pump in this issue of killing in the city of Philadelphia. So when you look at that, you may say, hey, you know what? Violence doesn't impact me. But when you look at it from a social standpoint, that money may be coming from something else that we could be using to address something else. So instead of us now saying, hey, let's take the money and let's go spend it on trying to solve violence, that money could have been allocated to building other programs that could help our children or even families. But because this social issue exists in society now, the government has to allocate some type of financial resource or some type of other resource out to the public now to address this social issue. And as I said, one of the aspects that I remember here was that there was a social issue that was being plagued within the city, and they had to actually increase what is called the sugar tax. So when you talk about taxes now, that's another way someone could actually impact us when we're talking about now, hey, it has nothing to do with us indirectly.